What would you do if you saw your pregnant ex-wife collapse on a beach, bleeding in the sand? Most people would rush to help, but Jackson Steele, a billionaire tech mogul worth $2.3 billion, did something that shocked everyone watching. He stood there and watched. The footage went viral within hours. But what happened next reveals a conspiracy so twisted, so calculated, that it defies belief. This isn't just about a messy divorce or a cheating scandal. This is about fake paternity tests, forged death certificates, and a plan so cruel it would make your blood run cold. Madison Cole thought she had lost everything when she discovered her husband's affair. She had no idea that was just the beginning, because Jackson Steele wasn't content with destroying her reputation, her career, and her financial future. He wanted something far more precious: her children. What you're about to hear is a true story of how far a powerful man will go to win at any cost. It's about stolen babies, fake funerals, and a mother's desperate fight against impossible odds. And I guarantee you, the ending will leave you speechless. But I need to warn you, this story gets dark before it gets light. So buckle up, because the next hour is going to take you on a journey you'll never forget. The 911 call came in at exactly 2:47 p.m. Pacific time on what had started as a perfect Tuesday afternoon in Malibu. The dispatcher's voice remained calm and professional, trained to handle emergencies with clinical precision. But the panic bleeding through from the other end of the line was unmistakable and raw. Emergency services. What's your emergency? There's a pregnant woman on the beach. She's bleeding everywhere. Oh God, there's so much blood. Please, you have to hurry. She just collapsed right in front of everyone. Sir, I need you to stay calm. I'm dispatching paramedics to your location now. Can you tell me more about her condition? Is she conscious? No, she's not moving. She's just lying there in the sand, and the blood is spreading everywhere. Wait, I think she might be going into labor. This is bad. This is really bad. Help is on the way, sir. Can you see if anyone there knows first aid? There's a nurse here. She's trying to help, but she says we need professionals fast. The woman looks really young, maybe early 30s, and she's really pregnant. Like, really pregnant. This could be twins or something. 24 hours earlier, Jackson Steele had been standing on the expansive marble balcony of his $12 million Malibu mansion, surveying his empire with the satisfaction of a man who had conquered every challenge life had thrown at him. At 35 years old, he commanded a net worth of $2.3 billion, built from nothing through sheer determination, ruthless business acumen, and an almost supernatural ability to predict market trends before his competitors even realized they existed. His company, SteelCore Industries, had revolutionized cloud computing infrastructure in ways that most people couldn't even comprehend. What had started as a small software development firm in a rented garage had grown into a technological behemoth that provided the backbone for half the internet. Jackson's innovations had made streaming services faster, online gaming more responsive, and digital commerce more secure. He was, by every measure that mattered in Silicon Valley, a visionary genius. Forbes had featured him on their cover just last month with the headline, "The Iron Will of Jackson Steele: How One Man Built Tomorrow's Internet." The article had praised his business instincts, his technological innovations, and his ability to remain focused on long-term growth while his competitors chased short-term profits. What the article hadn't mentioned was the personal cost of that focus, the relationships sacrificed on the altar of success, the moral compromises that had paved his path to the top. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows of his mansion showed a man who appeared to have everything: 6 feet 2 inches of lean muscle maintained by a personal trainer who charged more per hour than most people made in a day, sharp jawline that had graced magazine covers and television interviews, the kind of confident smile that had charmed investors out of hundreds of millions of dollars and convinced world leaders to take his phone calls. Designer clothes that cost more than luxury cars, handmade Italian shoes that were crafted specifically for his feet, and a watch collection worth more than most people's houses. But today, something felt fundamentally different. Today felt like the calm before a hurricane that he couldn't see coming but could somehow sense approaching. There was a tension in the air, an electricity that made him restless and uneasy in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "Jackson, darling, are you ready for our close-up?" Scarlett Hayes emerged from the master bedroom like a vision from a high-end fashion magazine. Her Instagram-perfect figure wrapped in a designer bikini that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. At 28, she had built a social media empire with 3 million followers who hung on her every carefully curated post, every strategically placed product placement, every glimpse into what appeared to be an impossibly glamorous lifestyle. Scarlett was beautiful in the way that only came from a combination of excellent genetics, expensive procedures, and the kind of professional maintenance that required a full-time team. Her blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her makeup always flawless, her body always camera-ready. She was, in many ways, the perfect accessory for a man like Jackson Steele. "The photographer will be here in an hour," Scarlett continued, checking her phone with the obsessive frequency of someone whose livelihood depended on social media engagement. "This beach shoot is going to be absolutely incredible for both our brands. Billionaire tech mogul and lifestyle influencer, living the dream in Malibu. The optics are perfect." Jackson nodded absently, his mind elsewhere. He had learned over the past 18 months that agreeing with Scarlett was usually the path of least resistance. Their relationship was as much a business arrangement as it was romantic, a mutually beneficial partnership that served both their professional interests. She provided him with youth, beauty, and social media relevance that helped humanize his corporate image. He provided her with luxury, status, access to his wealthy network, and the kind of lifestyle content that kept her followers engaged and her endorsement deals flowing. But lately, something had been gnawing at him, a feeling he couldn't quite identify, something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. No, Jackson Steele didn't do guilt. Guilt was for people who made mistakes, and Jackson had built his fortune by making calculated decisions and never looking back. Regret was a luxury he couldn't afford, a weakness that could destroy everything he had worked to build. His phone buzzed with a text from his publicist, Miranda Chen, who managed his image with the precision of a military operation. "Beach shoot looking absolutely perfect entertainment. Tonight wants an exclusive interview about your new life and relationship. They're calling it your redemption story. How's the happiness level today?" Jackson typed back quickly, his fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. "Never been better. Living the dream and looking forward to the future." It wasn't entirely a lie, at least not by the standards he had learned to live by. By every measurable metric that mattered in his world, his life was perfect. The messy divorce from Madison had been finalized 8 months ago, and his legal team had been ruthless but effective in ensuring that she walked away with minimal assets and a reputation in tatters. The affair with Scarlett had been exposed publicly, generating weeks of negative headlines. But his PR team had spun it masterfully into a narrative of personal growth and new beginnings. Jackson Steele was now the eligible billionaire bachelor who had escaped a toxic marriage and found true love with a vibrant, successful woman who understood his ambitions and supported his dreams. The media had largely bought into this narrative, especially after Scarlett's team had planted stories suggesting that Madison had been controlling, jealous, and unsupportive of Jackson's career. The narrative was clean, profitable, and completely fabricated. As Jackson watched the waves crash against his private beach below, their rhythmic motion normally soothing, but today somehow ominous, he couldn't shake a memory that had been haunting him for weeks. Madison's face during their final court appearance, 8 months ago, when the judge had delivered the final ruling on their divorce settlement. She had looked so small sitting at that cheap wooden table with her overmatched public defender, a recent law school graduate who was clearly intimidated by Jackson's team of high-powered attorneys from the most prestigious firm in Los Angeles. Her clothes had been simple and inexpensive, a stark contrast to the tailored suits and designer accessories that filled Jackson's side of the courtroom. When the judge had ruled in Jackson's favor on nearly every contested point, awarding him the house, the art collection, the investment portfolio, and most of their shared assets, Madison hadn't even looked surprised. She had simply gathered her few papers, stood up with quiet dignity, and walked out of his life forever. Or so he had thought at the time, so he had convinced himself was for the best. 8 months earlier, Madison Cole had been living a completely different life, one that felt like a fairy tale compared to the nightmare her existence would become. As the head of marketing for Sterling and Associates, a boutique advertising firm in Beverly Hills that specialized in luxury brands and high-end consumer products. She had carved out her own successful career in one of the most competitive industries in the world. Madison was brilliant at her job, possessed of an intuitive understanding of consumer psychology and brand positioning that had made her one of the most sought-after marketing executives in Los Angeles. She had worked on campaigns for fashion houses, jewelry companies, exclusive restaurants, and technology startups, always finding the perfect angle to make products irresistible to their target demographics. Her corner office had offered a view of the Hollywood Hills, and her salary had been substantial enough to afford her own luxury condo in West Hollywood, complete with a rooftop deck and a view of the city lights. She had been independent, successful, and proud of everything she had built through her own talent and hard work. She and Jackson had met at TechCrunch Disrupt, a major technology conference where she had been presenting on digital brand strategy for emerging companies. Her presentation, titled Building Emotional Connections in the Digital Age, had drawn a packed audience of entrepreneurs, investors, and industry leaders. Jackson had been in the front row, leaning forward with obvious interest as Madison had explained how successful companies created lasting relationships with customers by understanding their deepest desires and fears. After her presentation, he had approached her with genuine enthusiasm for her ideas and a charm that had been impossible to resist. "That was brilliant," he had said, his smile warm and authentic in a way that set him apart from the usual tech bros who dominated these conferences. "You understand something that most people in this industry miss completely? Technology is just a tool. The real magic happens when you connect with people on an emotional level." Their first conversation had lasted 3 hours, continuing through the networking reception and extending to a late dinner at a small Italian restaurant that Jackson had somehow convinced to stay open past closing time. Madison had been charmed not just by his success and intelligence, but by his apparent vulnerability, the way he had opened up about his childhood, his dreams, his fears about whether his rapid success was sustainable. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of experiences that Madison had never imagined possible. Private jets to Paris for weekend getaways, surprise trips to Napa Valley, where they had stayed in vineyard estates that weren't even open to the public, front row seats at exclusive events where celebrities and world leaders mingled casually. Jackson had introduced her to a world of luxury and privilege that had felt both exciting and slightly overwhelming. But what had won Madison's heart wasn't the expensive gestures. It was the quiet moments when Jackson had let his guard down, when he had talked about his loneliness despite his success, his desire to build something meaningful with someone who understood both his ambitions and his insecurities. He had seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts, her career, her dreams for the future. Jackson had proposed after only 6 months of dating, presenting her with a 5-carat diamond ring during a sunset helicopter ride over the Pacific Ocean. The ring had been beautiful, but Madison had been more moved by his words, his promise that they would build a life together based on mutual respect, shared goals, and unwavering support for each other's dreams. "I want to be your partner in everything," he had said as the helicopter hovered over the waves. "Your success matters as much to me as my own. We're going to build something amazing together." Madison had thought she was living in a fairy tale, the kind of love story that happened to other people in movies and romance novels. She should have known that fairy tales were just stories people told to make the harsh realities of life more bearable. Fantasies designed to distract from the truth that real life was messier, crueler, and more unpredictable than any happy ending. The first crack in their perfect facade had appeared during their second year of marriage. Subtle at first, but growing more obvious as the months passed, Jackson had become increasingly distant, working late nights that stretched past midnight and taking mysterious phone calls that he would step outside to answer. When Madison had asked about these calls, he had dismissed them as boring business conversations that wouldn't interest her. Madison had convinced herself it was just the pressure of growing his company. Steelcore was in the middle of a massive expansion, preparing for an IPO that would make Jackson one of the wealthiest men in America. The stress was enormous, the stakes higher than anything either of them had experienced before. It made sense that he would be distracted, focused entirely on ensuring that everything went perfectly. She had tried to be supportive, taking on more of the household responsibilities and giving him space to focus on his work. When he had missed their second anniversary dinner because of an emergency board meeting, she had understood. When he had canceled their planned vacation to Tuscany because of complications with a major acquisition, She had rescheduled without complaint. Madison had been so focused on being the perfect supportive wife that she had missed the signs that Jackson's distance had nothing to do with work pressure and everything to do with another woman. The discovery had come on a Thursday evening in October, when Madison had decided to surprise Jackson at his office with his favorite takeout from Nobu, the exclusive Japanese restaurant where they had celebrated their engagement. She had been feeling disconnected from her husband and had hoped that a spontaneous dinner together might recapture some of the intimacy they had lost. The security guard at Steel Corps knew Madison well from her many visits over the years and had waved her through the lobby without question. She had taken the private elevator to the executive floor, balancing the expensive takeout containers and planning her surprise, imagining Jackson's delight at seeing her and his favorite food. The surprise had been entirely on her. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of Jackson's conference room, Madison had seen her husband locked in a passionate embrace with Scarlett Hayes, the Instagram influencer she had met briefly at a charity gala several months earlier. But this wasn't a casual kiss or a moment of weakness. Jackson's hands were tangled in Scarlett's perfectly styled blonde hair, and she was pressed against the conference table with her legs wrapped around his waist, her designer dress bunched up around her thighs. They were lost in each other, completely oblivious to the world around them, moving together with the familiarity of lovers who had been intimate many times before. This wasn't the beginning of an affair. This was a well-established relationship that had been hidden from Madison for who knew how long. Madison had dropped the food containers, and they had crashed to the marble floor with a sound like thunder, sending miso soup and perfectly prepared sashimi sliding across the expensive stone surface. The crash had been loud enough to penetrate the glass conference room, and Jackson and Scarlett had quickly separated, both trying desperately to look professional and innocent. But it was far too late. Madison had seen everything, and the image was burned into her memory with perfect clarity. The confrontation that had followed had been brutal in ways that Madison couldn't have anticipated. Jackson hadn't even attempted to deny the affair or express remorse for his betrayal. Instead, he had immediately gone on the offensive, attacking Madison with a cruelty that had left her reeling. "This marriage has been dead for months. Madison," he had said, his voice cold and clinical, as if he were discussing a failed business venture rather than the destruction of their life together. "I was just too polite to tell you directly." "How long has this been going on?" Madison had asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Does it matter? The point is that Scarlett understands me in ways you never did. She supports my ambitions instead of trying to make everything about herself. She's exciting, spontaneous, and she doesn't spend every conversation trying to analyze our relationship to death." Each word had been carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage, to tear down not just their marriage but Madison's sense of self-worth. Jackson had attacked her personality, her career, her appearance, and her value as a partner with surgical precision. Madison had fled Steel Corps that night in a state of shock that bordered on dissociation. The drive back to their Malibu mansion had passed in a blur of tears and disbelief, her mind struggling to process the complete destruction of everything she had thought was real and permanent in her life. She had stayed with her best friend Riley Martinez, an investigative journalist based in San Francisco, while she tried to make sense of what had happened and figure out how to move forward. Riley had been furious on Madison's behalf, offering to use her media connections to expose Jackson's affair and destroy his carefully cultivated public image. But Madison had wanted to handle the situation privately, to preserve whatever dignity she could from the wreckage of her marriage. She had believed, naively, that they could divorce quietly and professionally, dividing their assets fairly and moving on with their separate lives without turning their personal tragedy into public entertainment. She couldn't have been more wrong about Jackson's intentions. Within 48 hours of their confrontation at his office, paparazzi photos of Jackson and Scarlett together had appeared on every major gossip website and entertainment news show. The photos showed them looking happy and relaxed, walking hand in hand on the beach, sharing intimate dinners at exclusive restaurants, and attending high-profile events as a couple. Someone with inside access had leaked intimate details about their affair, painting a narrative that was carefully crafted to damage Madison while making Jackson appear sympathetic. The stories suggested that Madison had been a controlling, emotionally unavailable wife who had been more interested in Jackson's wealth than in building a real relationship with him. Anonymous sources, clearly from Jackson's inner circle, provided quotes that portrayed Madison as manipulative and gold-digging. She never really understood Jackson's vision, one source had told People magazine. She was always trying to hold him back, make him choose between his career and their marriage. Jackson needed someone who could match his energy and ambition. The narrative was as effective as it was false. Jackson became the successful entrepreneur who had been trapped in a loveless marriage and had finally found true happiness with a woman who appreciated his achievements. Madison became the bitter ex-wife who couldn't accept that their relationship had run its course. The humiliation had been devastating, but Madison had tried to maintain her dignity and focus on moving forward. She was talented, educated, and financially independent. She could survive this betrayal and rebuild her life on her own terms. Then she had discovered she was pregnant. The timing was cosmically cruel. Madison had conceived during what she now understood had been Jackson's final attempts to maintain the facade of their marriage. Probably around the same time he had been deepening his relationship with Scarlett. The pregnancy test had shown positive results 2 months into their separation. When Madison had been experiencing persistent nausea and exhaustion that she had initially attributed to stress and emotional trauma, 2 pink lines on a plastic stick had changed everything yet again, adding an entirely new dimension of complexity to an already impossible situation. Madison had called Jackson immediately after confirming the pregnancy with her doctor. Her hands had been shaking as she dialed his number, knowing that this conversation would alter both their lives forever, hoping against hope that the prospect of becoming a father might awaken some vestige of the man she had once loved. "Jackson, I need to talk to you. It's extremely important and it can't wait." "Madison, my lawyer specifically instructed you that all communication should go through legal channels now. I can't have you calling me directly anymore. It's inappropriate given our situation. I'm pregnant. Jackson, the baby is yours." The silence on the other end of the line had stretched for so long that Madison had wondered if the call had dropped or if Jackson had simply hung up on her. When he finally spoke, his voice had been ice cold, completely devoid of any emotion or recognition of the magnitude of what she had just told him. "That's impossible. I always use protection with you." The casual cruelty of his response had left Madison speechless. Not only was he denying the biological reality of their situation, but he was also suggesting that their intimate life had been purely mechanical on his end, something requiring protection rather than the expression of love she had believed it to be. "Jackson, please, I know this is complicated and the timing is terrible, but we need to figure this out like adults. I'm carrying your child. That creates certain responsibilities and obligations that we can't just ignore. My lawyer will be in touch," he had said, and then the line had gone dead. Within 24 hours, Jackson's legal team had launched a devastating offensive that made their previous divorce proceedings look like a friendly negotiation. They had filed emergency motions demanding immediate paternity testing and had suggested in court documents that Madison was attempting to trap Jackson with a pregnancy that might not even be his. Worse than the legal maneuvering was the public relations campaign that accompanied it. Someone had leaked the court filings to entertainment news outlets, complete with salacious details about Madison's alleged infidelity and gold-digging motivations. The headlines had been brutal and inescapable. "Gold digger's last stand, desperate ex-wife claims pregnancy. Steel magnate's ex plays baby card in divorce battle. From fairy tale to nightmare. Madison Cole's desperate pregnancy gambit." The stories painted Madison as a conniving woman who was using a potentially fabricated pregnancy to extort money from her wealthy ex-husband. Anonymous sources, obviously from Jackson's public relations team, provided quotes suggesting that Madison had been trying to get pregnant throughout their marriage specifically to secure her financial future through child support payments. The narrative was not just false, but exactly opposite to the truth. Madison and Jackson had discussed having children extensively during their marriage, but they had mutually agreed to wait until after SteelCor's initial public offering was complete and Jackson's financial situation was more stable. Madison had been on birth control throughout their entire relationship, taking her pills religiously every morning. The pregnancy had been as much a surprise to her as it apparently was to Jackson. But truth was irrelevant in the court of public opinion that Jackson's team was manipulating so expertfully. The story of a successful, attractive billionaire being hunted and manipulated by his desperate ex-wife made for much better headlines than a more complex narrative about a cheating husband abandoning his pregnant wife. Madison's employer, Sterling and Associates, had called her into an emergency meeting 3 days after the pregnancy story broke nationwide. Madison, I'm truly sorry about your personal situation, her boss, Richard Sterling, had said, his voice filled with what sounded like genuine regret. But we simply cannot have this kind of negative publicity associated with our firm. Our clients are already asking uncomfortable questions about your situation, and several have expressed concerns about working with us while you're on staff. Richard, you know me. You know my work. This is all lies and manipulation by Jackson's team. I believe you, Madison. But unfortunately, belief isn't enough when it comes to protecting our business relationships. I'm going to have to let you go, effective immediately. We'll provide 2 weeks severance pay and positive references for future employers who don't know about this situation. Just like that, Madison had lost her job, her reputation, and her financial security. The divorce settlement had been minimal because Jackson's lawyers had successfully argued that Madison's career prospects had been damaged by her own poor decisions and public behavior, not by the end of their marriage or Jackson's conduct. With no income and mounting legal bills that were growing larger every day, Madison had been forced to sell her West Hollywood condo at a significant loss and move to a small coastal town 2 hours north of Los Angeles. The rent was affordable, and she had hoped to find remote work in marketing or consulting while she prepared for the birth of her child and tried to rebuild her professional reputation. She had never expected to discover she was carrying twins. The ultrasound at 20 weeks had revealed 2 healthy babies developing normally, their tiny hearts beating strong and fast on the grainy black and white monitor. Madison had been alone in the examination room, staring at the miraculous images of her children while tears of joy and terror streamed down her face. 2 babies meant twice the expenses, twice the sleepless nights, twice the overwhelming responsibility of raising children as a single mother with no support system and limited financial resources. But it also meant twice the love, twice the purpose, twice the reason to fight for a better future. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the obstetrician who had been monitoring Madison's pregnancy, had printed out several ultrasound photos and handed them to her with a warm smile. They're beautiful. Madison, both babies are developing perfectly, right on schedule. Based on their positioning and growth rates, I'd estimate you're carrying a boy and a girl. Madison had stared at the photos, trying to make sense of the abstract shapes that represented her children. These tiny beings were depending on her completely, and she was determined not to let them down despite the impossible circumstances she found herself in. She had called Jackson that afternoon to tell him about the twins, hoping that the news might penetrate whatever emotional barriers he had constructed around himself. Surely learning that he was going to be the father of 2 children would make him reconsider his cruel treatment of their situation. But Jackson's assistant had intercepted the call with a message that felt like a physical blow. Mr. Steele has instructed me to inform you that he will only accept communication through his attorney, David Park, regarding any matters related to your ongoing legal disputes. He will not be taking personal calls or responding to direct contact attempts. Madison had hung up the phone and cried for 2 hours, mourning not just for herself, but for her unborn children, who would grow up without knowing their father because of his stubborn pride and calculated cruelty. She had been completely unprepared for what Jackson's legal team would do next. 3 weeks later, Madison had received a certified letter from David Park, Jackson's lead attorney, containing documents that had made her blood run cold. Jackson was demanding not just paternity testing, but custody evaluation, psychological assessment, and financial review of Madison's ability to provide adequate care for the children. The legal motion painted Madison as an unstable, financially irresponsible woman whose lifestyle and mental state posed potential dangers to fetal development and child welfare. It cited her job loss, her reduced living circumstances, her lack of health insurance, and her documented history of erratic behavior and public outbursts as evidence that she was unfit to be a mother. Jackson's team had been building a case to take the children away from her before they were even born. The motion requested that the court appoint a guardian ad litem to oversee Madison's pregnancy and make medical decisions in the best interests of the unborn children. It also sought to establish a trust fund for the children's care that would be administered by Jackson's representatives rather than Madison herself. Madison had taken the documents to her public defender, a overwhelmed recent law school graduate named Jennifer Walsh, who was handling her case for free through a legal aid program. Jennifer had read through the motion with growing alarm. Madison, this is unlike anything I've seen before. Jackson's team is essentially arguing that you're an unfit mother before you've even given birth. They're trying to establish legal precedent that would give Jackson control over every aspect of your pregnancy and the children's lives. Can they do that? Can they legally take my children away from me? In extreme cases, yes. If they can prove that your circumstances pose a genuine threat to the children's welfare, the court might intervene. But Madison, the standard for this kind of intervention is usually reserved for cases involving drug addiction, domestic violence, or severe mental illness. None of which apply to me. I know that, and you know that. But Jackson's team is building a narrative that poverty and emotional instability are themselves forms of child endangerment. They're arguing that your inability to provide premium medical care, stable housing, and educational opportunities constitutes neglect. Madison had felt the world spinning around her as she realized the full scope of Jackson's plan. He wasn't just trying to avoid paying child support or taking responsibility for his children. He was systematically destroying her life in order to steal her babies and raise them with Scarlett as if they were his own legitimate family. It was a level of cruelty and calculation that she hadn't thought was possible, even from the man who had already betrayed her so thoroughly. "What can we do?" Madison had asked. Jennifer had looked at her with obvious sympathy and frustration. "Honestly, not much. Jackson has unlimited resources and the best legal team money can buy. Our strategy has to be defensive at this point. We need to document everything you're doing right, every prenatal appointment you attend, every healthy choice you make, every indication that you're going to be a good mother. And if that's not enough, then we pray that the judge sees through their manipulation and rules based on what's actually best for the children, rather than what's most convenient for Jackson Steele." Madison had left the legal aid office feeling more alone and terrified than at any point in her life. She was fighting a battle against forces that had unlimited resources, political connections, and a willingness to use any tactic necessary to achieve their goals. But she was also carrying two innocent lives who deserved better than to be treated as pawns in Jackson's game of power and revenge, whatever it took, however hard she had to fight. Madison was determined to protect her children from their father's toxic influence. She just hadn't anticipated how far Jackson would be willing to go to win. 7 months into her pregnancy, Madison's life had settled into a routine that was exhausting but manageable. She had taken a job as a waitress at the Lighthouse Cafe, a small beachside restaurant in the coastal town where she had relocated after losing everything in Los Angeles. The work was physically demanding, especially while carrying twins, but the owner, Frank Morello, had been understanding about her condition and flexible with her schedule. "You work as long as you can, honey," Frank had told her on her first day, his weathered face showing the kindness of a man who had raised 5 daughters of his own. "When those babies come, your job will be waiting for you when you're ready to come back." The pay wasn't much, but the tips were decent, especially during the summer tourist season when wealthy visitors from Los Angeles would drive up the coast for weekend getaways. Madison had been saving every dollar she could, building a small nest egg to help with medical bills and baby expenses that seemed to grow more expensive every time she researched them. The twins were healthy and active, moving constantly inside her increasingly cramped womb. Her doctor had told her that everything looked normal, but carrying multiples was inherently higher risk than a single pregnancy. Madison needed more frequent monitoring, more nutritional supplements, and more rest than she was able to get while working full-time on her feet. On this particular Tuesday morning in late summer, Madison had woken up feeling especially tired and uncomfortable. Her back ached from the additional weight she was carrying. Her ankles were swollen despite her attempts to elevate them whenever possible. And she had barely slept the night before because the baby seemed to be having some kind of dance party every time she tried to lie down. But she couldn't afford to call in sick or take time off. Every shift represented money for diapers, formula, cribs, car seats, and the 1,000 other items that 2 babies would need. Madison had been living on an extremely tight budget, shopping at thrift stores and accepting donations from local churches to prepare for her children's arrival. The Lighthouse Cafe sat directly on Malibu Beach, offering stunning panoramic ocean views and overpriced but genuinely delicious food to tourists and locals who could afford to pay premium prices for the location. Madison had been working there for 4 months and had settled into a comfortable rhythm with her regular customers and the other staff members, who had become something like a surrogate family. She had just finished serving coffee and pastries to a table of yoga instructors who came in every Tuesday after their beach class when she noticed unusual activity near the water. A professional photography crew was setting up elaborate lighting equipment and reflective panels, while security guards were cordoning off a section of the public beach with velvet ropes and privacy screens. Probably some movie star or social media influencer doing a photo shoot, Frank had said, bringing Madison a glass of ice water and noticing her staring out the window. Happens all the time around here during the summer. You should sit down for a few minutes. Madison, you look pale, and it's going to be a busy lunch rush. Madison had waved off his concern, unable to afford the luxury of taking breaks when there were customers to serve and tips to earn. But as she walked toward the window to check on her outdoor tables, she had seen something that made her blood freeze in her veins. Jackson Steele stood 50 yards away on the sand, posing for photographers in designer swim shorts and a linen shirt that probably cost more than Madison made in a month. His body looked exactly as she remembered, lean and muscular, maintained by personal trainers and nutritionists who catered to his every physical need. His arm was wrapped possessively around Scarlett Hayes, who was laughing with apparent delight and flipping her professionally styled blonde hair for the cameras. She wore a tiny bikini that showed off her perfect figure and a smile that looked natural, but was probably as carefully crafted as everything else in her public image. They looked like the perfect couple, wealthy and beautiful and blissfully happy, living the kind of lifestyle that most people could only dream about. The contrast with Madison's current reality was devastating and deliberate. Of all the beaches in Southern California, of all the possible locations for their photo shoot, Jackson had chosen this one. The same beach where his pregnant ex-wife worked as a waitress, struggling to make ends meet while carrying his children. The timing and location couldn't possibly be coincidental. Madison's knees had gone weak as the full implications of the situation hit her. This wasn't just bad luck or cosmic irony. This was a calculated move in Jackson's ongoing campaign to destroy her emotionally and psychologically. She had tried to duck back into the restaurant before Jackson noticed her, but it was too late. Their eyes had met across the sand, and his expression had shifted from practiced smile to shocked recognition in an instant. For just a moment, his careful composure had slipped, and Madison had seen something that might have been guilt or regret flicker across his features. But the moment had passed quickly, replaced by the cold calculation that had become Jackson's default expression whenever he looked at her. Madison. Jackson had taken a step toward her, ignoring the photographer who was trying to get his attention back on the shoot. Jackson, please, Madison had said, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. I'm working. Just leave me alone. You're pregnant. It wasn't a question. Even from a distance, her condition was impossible to ignore. Madison was 7 months along with twins, her belly enormous and unmistakable. Congratulations, detective, Madison had replied, her old sarcasm flaring up despite her exhaustion and emotional vulnerability. You always were brilliant at stating the obvious. Scarlett had noticed Jackson's distraction and was now looking in Madison's direction with obvious disdain and calculation. Even from 50 yards away, Madison could see the wheels turning in the younger woman's head, probably already planning how to spin this encounter to their advantage. Jackson, darling, the photographer is waiting, Scarlett had called out, her voice carrying easily across the beach with the kind of projected confidence that came from years of performing for cameras. Madison had turned to go back into the restaurant, desperate to escape this humiliating encounter and return to the safety of her work routine. But the stress of seeing Jackson, combined with her physical exhaustion, the emotional trauma of the confrontation, and the oppressive heat of the California sun, had been too much for her already strained system. The twins had started moving frantically inside her, as if they could sense their mother's distress and were responding with their own agitation. Madison had felt dizzy and disoriented, her vision blurring at the edges as her blood pressure spiked dangerously. I need to sit down, she had whispered to herself, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The world had started spinning faster and faster, the sounds of the beach becoming distant and distorted. The last thing Madison remembered was the sensation of falling, the sand rushing up to meet her, and the distant sound of someone screaming for help. Then everything had gone black, and she had collapsed unconscious on the beach where her ex-husband was posing for glamour shots with his new girlfriend. When Madison collapsed on the sand, her body hitting the beach with a sickening thud that seemed to echo across the suddenly silent stretch of coastline, the response from bystanders was immediate and instinctive. A jogger who was also a registered nurse had immediately abandoned her morning run and knelt beside Madison's unconscious form, checking for a pulse and airway obstruction. A lifeguard had sprinted over with a first aid kit and emergency oxygen. Beachwalkers had formed a protective circle around the scene, some calling 911 while others tried to provide shade and privacy for the medical emergency unfolding before them. But Jackson Steele, the father of the children Madison was carrying, had simply stood there and stared. Multiple witnesses would later tell reporters and post on social media that the billionaire tech mogul had remained frozen in place for crucial seconds while his pregnant ex-wife lay bleeding and unconscious on the sand. While strangers jumped into action to help a woman in obvious distress, Jackson had been paralyzed by what looked to observers like callous indifference. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," Maria Santos, a local resident who had been walking her dog, later told a gossip blogger. This woman was obviously in serious medical distress, maybe dying, and her ex-husband just watched like he was observing some kind of scientific experiment. It was the most inhuman thing I've ever witnessed. The moment had been captured on dozens of cell phones by beachgoers who had initially been taking photos of the professional photo shoot. Within hours, the footage would be trending on every major social media platform with hashtags like Jackson Steele Monster, Billionaire Sociopath, and Pregnant Wife Abandoned. But Jackson's paralysis in that critical moment wasn't born of callousness or calculated indifference. It was the result of being overwhelmed by a crushing realization of his own responsibility for Madison's condition. Seeing his ex-wife collapsed and bleeding, her body clearly showing the strain of carrying his children while living in poverty and stress that he had created. Jackson had been hit by a wave of guilt so powerful it had literally immobilized him. Not just guilt about the pregnancy, though that was certainly part of it, guilt about her entire situation, her poverty, her isolation, her struggle to survive while carrying twins, her loss of career and reputation and support system. All of it could be traced directly back to his betrayal and the scorched earth legal campaign that had followed their divorce. In that moment of clarity, Jackson had seen himself as he truly was, not a successful businessman protecting his interests, but a cruel man who had systematically destroyed the life of someone who had once loved him completely. It was Scarlett who had broken through his paralysis. "Jackson, we need to go right now," she had hissed, grabbing his arm with manicured nails that dug into his skin. "Before someone recognizes you and starts asking questions that we can't answer." "She's bleeding," Jackson had said, his voice hollow and distant. "She might be dying. Scarlett, those are my children." "That's not our problem," Scarlett had replied, her voice sharp with panic and calculation. "This is going to be a public relations nightmare if you get involved. We need to leave immediately, before the paramedics arrive and start asking for information." The photographer, sensing that his planned shoot was completely derailed, had already started packing up his expensive equipment. The security guards were moving to escort Jackson and Scarlett away from the scene, following protocols that had been established to protect their client from any unwanted publicity or legal complications. Jackson had taken one instinctive step toward Madison, some buried part of him recognizing that he should be with her, helping her, taking responsibility for his role in her condition. But Scarlett had tightened her grip on his arm, her voice becoming more urgent. "Jackson, think about your company. Think about the IPO that's launching next month. Think about our future together. You cannot be associated with this disaster. Let the paramedics and the hospital handle it. That's what they're paid for." Against every decent instinct he possessed, Jackson had allowed himself to be led away from the scene. He had climbed into his Tesla and driven off just as the wailing of ambulance sirens became audible in the distance, leaving his pregnant ex-wife in the hands of strangers while he fled to protect his reputation and business interests. By the time paramedics had arrived, Madison was conscious but weak, her vital signs indicating a dangerous spike in blood pressure that suggested preeclampsia, a potentially fatal condition that threatened both her life and the lives of her unborn children. "Ma'am, we need to get you to Cedar-Sinai immediately," the lead paramedic had said after quickly assessing her condition. "You're showing signs of severe preeclampsia, and we think you may be going into premature labor." Madison had been loaded into the ambulance and rushed through traffic to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, the same prestigious hospital where she had originally planned to deliver her twins in a luxury suite before her financial situation had made such accommodations impossible. Instead, she had been taken directly to the emergency room, where a team of doctors and nurses had worked frantically to stabilize her blood pressure and halt the premature contractions that could have resulted in the birth of 28-week twins with little chance of survival outside the womb. Meanwhile, the cell phone footage of Jackson's non-response had already begun circulating on social media platforms, going viral with a speed and intensity that surprised even experienced entertainment journalists. The video quality was grainy and the audio was poor, but the images were clear enough to show Jackson standing motionless while his pregnant ex-wife lay unconscious on the sand. Even more damaging was footage showing Scarlett physically pulling Jackson away from the scene, her body language suggesting urgency and panic rather than concern for Madison's welfare. The optics were absolutely devastating for Jackson's carefully maintained public image. By evening, the story had been picked up by major entertainment news outlets, celebrity gossip blogs, and even mainstream news organizations that normally didn't cover celebrity drama. Jackson's publicist, Miranda Chen, had been fielding calls from reporters all day, trying desperately to craft a response that wouldn't make the situation worse. The official statement that SteelCor's PR team had released had been a masterpiece of corporate damage control, but it had only served to pour gasoline on the fire of public outrage. Mr. Steele was shocked and concerned when he witnessed Ms. Cole's medical emergency. He immediately ensured that proper medical assistance was summoned and has since learned of Ms. Cole's hospitalization. Mr. Steele wishes Ms. Cole and her children a full and speedy recovery and asks that the media respect their privacy during this difficult time. The statement had been carefully crafted to avoid any admission of responsibility or personal connection to Madison's pregnancy. But it had come across as cold and calculated to a public that had just watched footage of Jackson abandoning his pregnant ex-wife on a beach. Social media had exploded with outrage at what seemed like a heartless response to a human crisis. The trending hashtags had been brutal: Jackson Steele heartless, billionaire abandons pregnant wife, and Steel Cold Monster had dominated Twitter for hours. But the real damage was yet to come, and it would arrive in the form of revelations that would make Jackson's beach behavior look like a minor character flaw compared to the systematic campaign of cruelty he had been waging against Madison for months. At Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, Madison had been stabilized after hours of intensive treatment, but her condition remained precarious. The emergency room doctors had managed to lower her blood pressure and stop the premature contractions that had threatened to trigger early labor, but she was far from out of danger. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician who had taken over Madison's care, had been blunt about the seriousness of her situation. "Ms. Cole, you're experiencing severe preeclampsia, which is a potentially life-threatening condition for both you and your babies," Dr. Chen had explained as Madison lay in the intensive care unit, connected to monitors that tracked her vital signs and the twins' heartbeats. "Your blood pressure reached dangerous levels, and we detected protein in your urine, which indicates that your kidneys are being affected." "Are my babies going to be okay?" Madison had asked, her voice weak but filled with desperate concern. "For now, yes. We've managed to stabilize your condition, and the baby's heart rates are strong. But you're going to need to remain on complete bed rest for the remainder of your pregnancy, which could be as long as 9 more weeks if we can prevent early labor." Madison had nodded weakly, trying to process the implications of extended hospitalization and bed rest. She had no health insurance that would cover private rooms or extended stays. She had no family nearby to provide support. Her savings were minimal, and every day in the hospital would cost thousands of dollars that she simply didn't have. "Doctor, I need to ask about the cost," Madison had said, embarrassed but desperate to understand her options. "I don't have insurance that covers this kind of extended care." Dr. Chen's expression had softened with genuine sympathy. "I understand your concerns, Miss Cole, but right now we need to focus on keeping you and your babies healthy. The hospital has financial assistance programs, and there may be other options we can explore." Madison had closed her eyes and tried not to think about the financial catastrophe that was already unfolding around her. Medical bills for high-risk pregnancy care could easily reach hundreds of thousands of dollars, money that she had no way to pay without destroying what little financial stability she had managed to maintain. A knock on her hospital room door had interrupted her worried thoughts. Madison had expected to see another nurse or doctor, but instead, a man in an expensive suit had entered, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of confident expression that came with wielding significant power. "Ms. Cole, my name is David Park. I'm an attorney representing Jackson Steel and Steel Core Industries." Madison's heart rate had immediately spiked, triggering alarms on the monitoring equipment that tracked her vital signs. The stress of seeing Jackson's lawyer was literally dangerous to her health and the health of her unborn children. "What do you want?" she had managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Steele wanted me to check on your condition and to provide you with this," Park had said, handing her an envelope with the Steel Core corporate logo embossed in gold. "He's prepared to cover all medical expenses related to your current hospitalization and the delivery of your children." Madison had torn open the envelope with shaking hands, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what Jackson might be planning now. Inside was a cashier's check for $100,000 and a legal document filled with dense legal language that she didn't immediately understand. "What is this document?" she had asked, scanning the pages of legal text. "It's a comprehensive settlement agreement," Park had explained in a tone that suggested he was doing her an enormous favor. "Mr. Steele is prepared to provide substantial financial support for you and the children, but he needs certain assurances in return." Madison had read more carefully, her growing alarm causing the monitoring equipment to beat more frantically. Buried in the legal language were clauses that would prevent her from speaking publicly about Jackson, their marriage, the circumstances of their divorce, or any aspect of their relationship. There were confidentiality agreements that would silence her permanently about Jackson's conduct and character. Most alarming of all was a section that granted Jackson consultative rights regarding major medical decisions affecting the pregnancy and the children's care, effectively giving him veto power over her healthcare choices. "He wants to control my medical treatment," Madison had said, her voice rising despite her weakness. "He wants to ensure that his children receive the best possible care," Park had corrected smoothly. "Mr. Steele has access to the finest medical specialists in the country. He can arrange for consultations with experts that you would never be able to afford on your own. And all I have to do is sign away my right to speak about what he's done to me. You need to think practically. Miss Cole, you have no insurance, no significant savings, and 2 high-risk babies on the way. This offer could solve all of your financial problems and ensure that your children receive world-class medical care from birth." Madison had crumpled up the check and thrown it at the lawyer, her anger giving her strength despite her physical weakness. "Get out," she had said, her voice shaking with fury. "Get out of my room right now." Park had calmly retrieved the crumpled check and smoothed it out, his expression never changing from professional neutrality. "Miss Cole, I understand you're emotional, but you need to consider your options realistically. This may be the most generous offer you receive. I'd encourage you to discuss it with your attorney before making any final decisions." After Park had left, Madison had immediately called the one person she trusted completely, her best friend Riley Martinez, who worked as an investigative journalist for the San Francisco Chronicle. "Riley, I need your help," Madison had said when her friend answered on the second ring. "Oh my God, Madison, I saw the videos online. Are you okay? Are the babies okay?" "For now, but Riley, something isn't right. Jackson's lawyer just offered me money to stay quiet about everything, but there's something else. Something I just figured out that makes no sense." "What do you mean?" Madison had taken a deep breath, the pieces finally clicking together in her mind with horrifying clarity. "The paternity test. Riley, remember how Jackson insisted on genetic testing during the divorce proceedings? He claimed he needed scientific proof that the babies were his before he would agree to any child support payments." "Right. And the test results came back negative, which was why the judge didn't award you any support for the children." "But Riley, I never cheated on Jackson. Not once. Not ever. These babies are his, and somewhere deep down, I think he's always known it." There had been silence on the other end of the line as Riley processed the implications of what Madison was suggesting. Madison, are you saying that Jackson somehow falsified the paternity test results? I'm saying that a man with $2.3 billion and a team of ruthless lawyers could probably influence any test result he wanted, especially if it meant avoiding 18 years of child support payments and protecting his reputation from the scandal of abandoning his pregnant wife. Riley's voice had gone cold and professional, the way it did when she caught the scent of a major story that could make her career. Madison, I'm coming down there tonight, and I'm bringing my recording equipment. Riley Martinez had arrived at Cedars-Sinai at 3 a.m., carrying a laptop bag filled with recording equipment and driven by the kind of fierce determination that had made her one of the most respected investigative journalists on the West Coast. She had been working the Madison Steele story since the beach incident went viral, and what she had uncovered in just 24 hours of digging was going to change everything. I've been researching Jackson's finances and legal team, Riley had said as she set up her laptop in Madison's hospital room, speaking quietly to avoid attracting attention from the nursing staff. What I found is going to shock you, but it's also going to give us the ammunition we need to fight back. Riley had pulled up a series of documents on her screen, bank records, corporate filings, and legal correspondence that she had obtained through her network of sources in the financial and legal communities. 3 days before your paternity test was conducted, Steelcore Industries made a payment of $250,000 to something called Meridian Medical Services. Riley had explained, pointing to highlighted entries in the financial records. I spent all day researching Meridian, and what I found is disturbing. Madison had felt her blood pressure rising again as she stared at the documents, the implications becoming clear even before Riley explained them fully. What kind of company is Meridian? Madison had asked. On the surface, it's described as a medical consulting firm that provides specialized laboratory services to high-net-worth individuals who require discretion and privacy in their healthcare. But when you dig deeper, Meridian is essentially a medical services company that specializes in providing whatever results their clients want, regardless of scientific accuracy. Riley had pulled up more documents, including testimonials from former employees and investigative reports from other journalists who had exposed similar operations. Madison, I think Jackson paid for false paternity test results. He bought a negative result to avoid child support obligations and to support his public narrative that you were trying to trap him with someone else's babies. The revelation had hit Madison like a physical blow, confirming suspicions she had been afraid to voice even to herself. Not only had Jackson cheated on her and destroyed her reputation, but he had also falsified scientific evidence to abandon his own children and avoid his financial and moral responsibilities as their father. But why would he offer me money now? Madison had asked. If he's been trying to avoid responsibility, why send his lawyer here with settlement offers? Riley had pulled up her laptop's web browser and navigated to Twitter, where hashtags related to Jackson and Madison were still trending 12 hours after the beach incident. Because the video of him abandoning you has gone completely viral, Jackson Steele Monster has been tweeted over 2 million times. His company's stock price has dropped 15% since this morning, wiping out nearly $500 million in market value. He's not offering you money out of guilt. Madison, he's trying to make this PR nightmare disappear before it destroys his business. Madison had closed her eyes, feeling overwhelmed by the cruelty and calculation of it all. Even her medical emergency had been converted into a business problem that Jackson was trying to solve with money and legal maneuvering. There's more, Riley had said quietly. I managed to obtain a recording of a phone conversation between Jackson and Scarlett from this morning. You need to hear this. But I'm warning you, it's going to be painful. Riley had played an audio file on her laptop. The quality was somewhat distorted, but Madison could clearly recognize Jackson's voice and Scarlett's distinctive tone. This is a complete disaster. Scarlett, the footage makes me look like a sociopathic monster. Because you acted like one. Jackson, but we can still control this situation if we're smart about it. We just need to flip the narrative and make her the villain again. How exactly do you propose we do that? Think about it logically. She's desperate, broke, and alone. She probably planned this whole thing to generate sympathy and force you into paying her money. I mean, what are the statistical odds that she would just happen to be working at the exact same beach where we were doing our photo shoot? Madison had felt physically sick listening to Scarlett's calculating tone and the ease with which she was constructing a false narrative to explain away their cruelty. "You really think she staged her own medical emergency?" Jackson had asked. "I think she's a lot smarter and more manipulative than you gave her credit for during your marriage. But we're smarter, and we have more resources. We'll offer her just enough money to make her go away permanently. And if she doesn't accept our terms, we'll destroy her so completely that no one will ever believe anything she says about us." How I have connections throughout the entertainment media industry. Jackson, we can plant stories suggesting that she's a psychotic stalker who has been harassing us for months. We can make it look like she deliberately endangered her own pregnancy for attention and money. We can turn her into the cautionary tale of what happens when gold diggers get desperate. The recording had ended, leaving Madison and Riley sitting in stunned silence in the dimly lit hospital room. "Madison," Riley had said finally, "I think they're planning something much bigger than just a financial settlement. Based on everything I've uncovered, I think Jackson wants to take your babies." As if the universe had been listening to their conversation, Madison's phone had buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Ms. Cole, this is David Park. Mr. Steele has revised his previous offer after considering the full scope of your situation. He is now prepared to provide $5 million for the complete care and custody of your children. Please consider this offer very carefully, as it may be the last one you receive. Time is a factor in this decision." Madison had shown the text to Riley, whose face had gone pale as she read the message. "Custody," Riley had whispered. "He's not trying to silence you anymore. Madison, he wants to take the twins and raise them with Scarlett as if they're his legitimate family." The next morning had brought a development that neither Madison nor Riley had anticipated, despite their growing understanding of Jackson's ruthless methods. Dr. Chen had arrived in Madison's room carrying legal documents and wearing an expression of professional concern mixed with obvious discomfort. "Ms. Cole, I'm afraid I have some very difficult news to share with you. The hospital's legal department has informed me that we received a court order yesterday evening regarding your medical care and the welfare of your unborn children." Madison had struggled to sit up in her hospital bed, ignoring the sharp pain in her lower back and the dizziness that came with sudden movement. "What kind of court order?" "Mr. Steele's attorneys have petitioned the family court for emergency intervention in your pregnancy, citing concerns about your ability to provide adequate prenatal care and a safe environment for fetal development. They've requested that all major medical decisions be made through a court-appointed guardian rather than by you directly." Madison had felt the world spinning around her as the implications became clear. "They can't do that. These are my children. I'm afraid that under California law, they can petition for this kind of intervention if they can demonstrate that the mother's circumstances pose a credible threat to fetal welfare. You have no health insurance, limited financial resources, and you've been classified as having a high-risk pregnancy complicated by severe preeclampsia." Riley had jumped up from her chair beside Madison's bed, her journalistic instincts immediately recognizing the legal maneuvering taking place. "This is insane. You can't take custody of children who haven't even been born yet." "Actually, you can," Dr. Chen had replied with obvious reluctance. "In cases where the mother's health, mental state, or living situation are deemed potentially harmful to fetal development, the court can intervene to protect the interests of the unborn children. It's rare, but it's not unprecedented." Madison had realized with growing horror that this was Jackson's real strategy. He hadn't wanted to pay her off to disappear quietly. He had been systematically maneuvering her into a position where he could legally take the children with the court's blessing, making himself appear to be the responsible parent protecting his offspring from an unfit mother. "The court-appointed guardian will be here this afternoon to discuss your medical care going forward." Dr. Chen had continued. "I'm truly sorry. Ms. Cole, I know this isn't what you expected or wanted to hear." After the doctor had left, Madison had suffered what her medical team would later describe as a stress-induced hypertensive crisis. The emotional shock of losing parental rights to her unborn children had triggered a dangerous spike in her blood pressure, causing severe headaches, vision problems, and contractions that threatened to induce premature labor. She had been rushed into emergency surgery to prevent what could have been a fatal stroke. leaving Riley to pace the surgical waiting room for 6 agonizing hours while Madison's life hung in the balance. During those hours, Jackson's legal team had worked with ruthless efficiency to solidify their position. By the time Madison emerged from surgery, weak and confused from anesthesia, they had secured temporary legal guardianship of the unborn twins and had convinced a family court judge that Madison represented a clear and present danger to her children's welfare. The second catastrophe had arrived while Madison was still recovering from her emergency surgery. When she had finally regained consciousness, she had found Jackson himself sitting in the chair beside her hospital bed, looking like a concerned and caring expectant father, rather than the man who had systematically destroyed her life. "Hello, Madison," he had said softly, his voice filled with what sounded like genuine concern. "I'm so glad you're okay. You gave everyone quite a scare." "Get out," Madison had whispered, barely able to speak through the effects of the medication and her own emotional exhaustion. "I know you're angry with me, and I understand why, but I want you to know that everything I've done has been for the benefit of our children. Your health crisis yesterday proved that you're not in a position to make rational decisions about their welfare." Madison had tried to sit up in the hospital bed, but her body wouldn't cooperate with her wishes. The surgery and medication had left her weak and disoriented. "You stole my children before they were even born," she had managed to say. "I protected them," Jackson had corrected gently. "Madison, do you have any idea what your stress levels and blood pressure spikes are doing to their neurological development? Do you understand that your current living situation and financial instability mean they won't receive adequate medical care after birth?" "I would have figured something out. I always do. Like you figured out how to keep your job after our divorce. Like you figured out how to afford health insurance. Madison, you're living in a complete fantasy. These children deserve better than constant stress and uncertainty." Jackson had leaned forward in his chair, his voice becoming more gentle but somehow more threatening at the same time. "I'm prepared to offer you one final deal. Sign over complete legal custody to me, and I'll provide you with enough money to start over somewhere else. A completely new life, away from all this mess and trauma." "And if I refuse," Jackson's expression had hardened into the cold calculation that Madison remembered from their worst fights during the marriage. "Then my lawyers will prove in court that you're an unfit mother who poses a danger to these children's health and development. I have documented evidence of your financial instability, your inability to provide proper medical care, your history of emotional outbursts and irrational behavior. I'll take the children anyway, and you'll walk away with nothing." Madison had closed her eyes, realizing that she was completely trapped. Jackson held all the power, all the money, all the legal advantages, and all the connections necessary to manipulate the system in his favor. She was fighting a battle that she couldn't possibly win with the resources available to her. "I need time to think about this," she had whispered. "You have until tomorrow morning," Jackson had said, standing up from his chair. "After that, my legal team will proceed with the full custody battle, and I promise you, Madison, you will not like how that ends." As Jackson had left the room, Madison had felt something fundamental break inside her. Not just her heart, which had been shattered months ago, but her spirit, her will to fight, her belief that justice and truth ultimately mattered in the world. She was going to lose her children to the man who had already taken everything else that mattered to her. The third catastrophe had been the cruelest of all, and it had come in the form of a realization that would haunt Madison for the rest of her life. Madison had spent that night staring at the acoustic ceiling tiles of her hospital room, weighing impossible choices while her unborn children moved restlessly inside her, as if they could sense their mother's anguish and desperation. Sign away her parental rights and receive enough money to start over somewhere else, or fight Jackson in court with no resources and almost certainly lose everything anyway, including any chance of being part of her children's lives. Riley had tried to encourage her to fight, bringing in legal aid lawyers and civil rights advocates who specialized in cases involving wealthy defendants who used the legal system to abuse their former partners. But they all acknowledged the harsh reality of Madison's situation. Jackson's unlimited resources and political connections made him virtually untouchable, especially when he was positioning himself as the responsible parent, protecting innocent children from an unstable mother. At 7 a.m. on what would prove to be the most important day of her life, Madison had made her decision. When David Park had arrived with the custody papers and a cashier's check for $2 million, Madison had signed the documents with hands that shook so badly she could barely hold the pen. "You're doing the right thing for everyone involved," Park had said as he collected the signed paperwork that legally terminated Madison's parental rights. "Mr. Steele will be an excellent father, and your children will have every advantage in life." Madison had wanted to laugh at the absurdity of that statement, but she no longer had the energy for anger or sarcasm. She felt completely hollow, emptied of everything that had once made her who she was. Riley had been furious, pacing the hospital room like a caged animal. "Madison, you can't do this. We can find another way to fight him. There have to be other options we haven't considered." "There is no other way, Riley," Madison had replied, her voice flat and emotionless. "At least this way, the babies will be safe and healthy. Jackson can give them everything I can't. The best schools, the best medical care, every opportunity I could never provide." But even as she had spoken the words, Madison had wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life, abandoning her children to a man who had proven capable of extraordinary cruelty. The twins had been born 3 days later via emergency cesarean section at 34 weeks gestation. Madison had been allowed to hold them for exactly 10 minutes. Emma Rose and Ethan James, names she had chosen months earlier during happier times when she had imagined raising them herself. They had been perfect, tiny but healthy, with strong cries and alert eyes that had seemed to look directly at their mother as if trying to memorize her face. Madison had whispered promises to them that she knew she might never be able to keep, telling them how much she loved them and how sorry she was for the circumstances that were separating them. Then Jackson's custody order had taken effect, and the twins had been transferred to the NICU under the care of medical specialists that Jackson had personally selected and was paying for privately. Madison had been discharged from the hospital that same day with instructions to rest and recover from her surgery. She had returned to her small apartment alone, her arms empty and her heart shattered beyond repair. For 3 weeks, she had tried to build some semblance of a normal life with the money Jackson had paid her. It was substantial enough to secure her financial future if she was careful, but every dollar felt like blood money, a constant reminder of what she had sacrificed for financial security. She had avoided social media, ignored news coverage of Jackson and Scarlett, and tried to focus on physical healing while ignoring the emotional devastation that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Madison had been alone in her apartment when she had received the phone call that would change everything yet again. "Miss Cole, this is Dr. Martinez from the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit at Cedars-Sinai. I'm calling about your son, Ethan." Madison's heart had stopped beating for several seconds, her worst fears crystallizing into terrifying reality. "What's wrong? Is he okay? Please tell me he's okay." "I'm so very sorry, Miss Cole. Ethan experienced severe complications last night related to his premature birth. We did everything medically possible, but he didn't survive. He passed peacefully, and I want you to know that he wasn't in any pain." The phone had fallen from Madison's numb fingers, clattering to the floor as she collapsed into the nearest chair. One of her babies was dead, and she hadn't even been legally allowed to be there with him during his final moments. The funeral had been a small, private affair that Madison had watched from across the street, unable to legally attend the burial of her own child. Jackson had carried what appeared to be a tiny white casket, while Scarlett had stood beside him in an appropriately somber black dress, playing the role of grieving stepmother for the photographer who had somehow learned about the service. Madison had returned to her apartment that evening and cried until she had no tears left to shed. She had lost a child, and the world had continued spinning as if nothing significant had happened. But Riley had never stopped investigating, driven by a fury that Madison could no longer summon. And what Riley had discovered 4 days after Ethan's funeral had shattered Madison's world all over again. "Madison, you need to sit down," Riley had said when she called, her voice tight with barely controlled excitement and anger. "Riley, I can't handle any more bad news. I literally cannot take another devastating revelation. My heart can't survive it." "This isn't bad news, Madison. This is the truth that's going to save your life. Madison, Ethan isn't dead." Madison had dropped her phone again, this time from shock rather than grief. "What did you say?" "I said Ethan isn't dead. Jackson faked his death certificate. He's been planning this for months, maybe from the very beginning. He wanted both babies, but he knew you would never stop fighting for them if you knew they were both alive and healthy. So he staged one of their deaths to break your spirit completely and stop you from ever trying to get them back. Madison had felt reality shifting sideways as she tried to process what Riley was telling her. That's impossible. I saw the funeral. I saw Jackson carrying the casket. You saw Jackson carrying a casket, but Madison, I have hospital records, birth certificates, and discharge paperwork. Two healthy babies left that hospital alive. Ethan James Steele was discharged the same day as Emma Rose Steele, and both children are currently living in Jackson's Malibu mansion. Riley had continued talking, explaining her investigation and the evidence she had gathered, but Madison had stopped hearing the individual words. Her son was alive. Jackson had convinced her that one of her children was dead to prevent her from fighting back against his custody theft. It was a level of psychological cruelty that Madison hadn't believed was possible, even from Jackson. Riley, she had whispered into the phone, I want them back. I want both of my children back. And I want Jackson Steele to pay for every single thing he's done to us. Then we're going to get them. Madison. But you need to be prepared for war, because this is going to get uglier than anything we've experienced so far. Madison had looked around her small, empty apartment at the life she had been trying to rebuild with blood money while her living children were being raised by their sociopathic father and his calculating girlfriend. Jackson Steele had taken everything from her marriage, her reputation, her career, her children, and finally her hope. He had systematically destroyed her life with the same methodical precision that he applied to his business dealings. But Jackson had made one critical, potentially fatal mistake. He had left her alive, aware of the truth, and filled with the kind of righteous fury that could move mountains and topple empires. The takedown, when it came, had been swift, comprehensive, and absolutely devastating to everything Jackson had built. Riley's investigation had uncovered a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple custody manipulation. Jackson had bribed doctors, falsified medical records, corrupted court officials, and committed federal crimes including kidnapping, fraud, and racketeering that violated numerous federal statutes. The FBI had become involved after Riley had presented her evidence to federal prosecutors who specialize in white-collar crime and corruption cases. When wealthy individuals use their resources to corrupt the legal system and commit crimes against their former spouses, it became a matter of federal interest. The plan to expose Jackson had been elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. Jackson had been scheduled to take his private jet to Switzerland with Emma and Ethan, apparently planning to live there permanently with Scarlett, beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement and extradition treaties. But the FBI had been waiting for him at the private aviation terminal. The footage of Jackson Steele being arrested in handcuffs while attempting to board his jet with two infant children had gone viral within minutes of being captured by news crews who had been tipped off about the operation. The same social media platforms that had once been used to destroy Madison's reputation had now become the vehicle for Jackson's complete downfall. Scarlett, faced with federal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to kidnapping, had immediately agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a plea agreement. She had provided recordings, text messages, financial documents, and testimony that confirmed every aspect of the conspiracy that Riley had uncovered. I never wanted to hurt the babies, Scarlett had testified during Jackson's trial, her Instagram-perfect appearance now replaced by prison-issued clothing and the hollow look of someone whose entire life had collapsed. But Jackson became obsessed with controlling every aspect of this situation. He convinced me that Madison was dangerous and unstable, and that we were protecting the children. The trial had lasted 4 months and had been covered by every major news outlet in the country, becoming a symbol of how wealth and power could corrupt the legal system when left unchecked. Madison had testified about the falsified paternity tests, the forged death certificates, and the systematic psychological torture that Jackson had inflicted on her. Jackson Steele had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. His company had collapsed within weeks of his arrest. His personal assets had been seized to pay restitution, and his reputation had been destroyed so completely that his name had become synonymous with corporate sociopathy and domestic abuse. But for Madison, the real victory had come on a sunny Tuesday morning when she had been reunited with Emma and Ethan at the FBI field office in Los Angeles. The twins, now 6 months old, had been healthy and well cared for, despite the trauma of their early lives. Madison had held them both for the first time since their birth, crying tears of joy and relief as they looked up at her with curious eyes that seemed to recognize their mother despite their separation. "I'm never letting you go again," she had whispered to them, her voice breaking with emotion. "Never, ever again." The civil lawsuit that had followed Jackson's criminal conviction had resulted in a settlement of $50 million, money that Madison had used to establish the Madison Cole Foundation for victims of domestic abuse and legal manipulation by wealthy ex-partners. Riley had won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative reporting on the case, using her platform to expose similar cases across the country where rich men had used the legal system to terrorize their former wives and steal their children. 2 years after Jackson's arrest, Madison had received word that he wanted to see her. She had driven to the federal correctional facility where he was serving his sentence, curious about what the man who had nearly destroyed her life might have to say. Jackson Steele, dressed in an orange prison jumpsuit and looking older than his 40 years, had been brought to the visitor's room in shackles. The confident, arrogant billionaire was gone, replaced by a broken man who had lost everything that had ever mattered to him. "Madison," he had said when she sat down across from him at the metal table, "I didn't think you would come." "I needed to see you," she had replied calmly. "I needed to look you in the eye and tell you something important." Jackson had waited, his hands folded in his lap, no longer the powerful man who had once commanded boardrooms and manipulated judges. "I forgive you," Madison had said simply. Jackson's eyes had filled with tears, the first genuine emotion Madison had seen from him in years. "I don't deserve that," he had whispered, his voice barely audible. "No, you don't. But I'm not forgiving you for your sake. Jackson, I'm forgiving you for mine and for our children. I refuse to let your hatred and cruelty poison our lives anymore." Madison had stood to leave, but Jackson had called her name one last time. "Are they happy?" he had asked, his voice breaking. "Emma and Ethan, are they happy and healthy?" Madison had looked at him through the reinforced glass partition, seeing not the powerful billionaire who had systematically destroyed her life, but a hollow man who had lost everything that actually mattered while chasing things that ultimately meant nothing. "They're perfect," she had said. "They're brilliant and curious and full of love, and they're safe." 8 months later, Madison had received word that Jackson had died in prison. The official cause was listed as cardiac arrest, but those who knew the full story suspected that the weight of his crimes and the knowledge of what he had lost had simply broken whatever was left of his heart. Madison had not attended his funeral. Instead, she had spent that day at the beach with Emma and Ethan, now healthy toddlers taking their first wobbly steps in the same sand where their mother had once collapsed in despair. As she watched her children play in the gentle waves, Madison reflected on the long journey that had brought them to this moment of peace and happiness. She had lost everything: her marriage, her reputation, her career, and nearly her children. But she had gained something far more valuable: the unshakable knowledge that love could triumph over hatred, that truth could overcome the most sophisticated lies, and that justice, however delayed, could still prevail against overwhelming odds. The Madison Cole Foundation had helped more than 15,000 single mothers in its first 5 years, providing legal representation, financial assistance, and emotional support to women fighting custody battles against wealthy ex-partners who use the legal system as a weapon. But Madison's greatest achievement was simpler and more profound than any foundation or public recognition. Emma Rose Steele Cole and Ethan James Steele Cole were growing up healthy, loved, and secure. They would know that their mother had fought the most powerful forces in society to keep them safe. They would understand that wealth and privilege could not ultimately defeat a mother's love. And they would learn that sometimes, when everything seems lost and the darkness appears overwhelming, ordinary people can find extraordinary courage to stand up against injustice and reclaim what rightfully belongs to them. As Madison watched her children laugh and chase seagulls along the shoreline, she smiled and whispered a quiet thank you to whatever forces in the universe had given her the strength to survive Jackson Steele's cruelty and build a new life from the ashes of her old one. She had won not because she was wealthy or powerful or politically connected, but because she had refused to give up on the most fundamental truth in the world: that love is stronger than hate, and that a mother's determination to protect her children can overcome any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it might appear. Emma ran up to her, sandy and giggling, holding a perfect seashell in her tiny fist. Mama shut, look what I found. Shiorana and Madison knelt down and examined the shell with appropriate wonder, marveling at how something so beautiful could emerge from the vast, turbulent ocean. It's perfect, sweetheart, just like you and your brother. And in that moment, surrounded by the sound of waves and children's laughter, Madison knew that she had finally found her way home. If this incredible story of justice and a mother's love moved you, I want to hear from you in the comments below. What would you have done in Madison's situation? Do you think Jackson got what he deserved? Or should his punishment have been even harsher? Your engagement means everything to creators like me who spend countless hours researching and crafting these true stories. If you found this story compelling, please hit that like button. It takes 2 seconds but helps more people discover content like this. And if you believe these stories need to be told, if you think the truth matters even when it's uncomfortable, then subscribe and ring that notification bell. I promise you'll never hear the same recycled content twice. Every story I tell is meticulously researched, ethically sourced, and designed to remind you that reality is often stranger and more dramatic than any fiction. Share this with someone who needs to hear that even in the darkest moments, hope can still prevail. Because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that remind us that good can triumph over evil, that love is stronger than hatred, and that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to give up. Until next time, keep believing in justice, keep fighting for what's right, and remember, the truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how deep someone tries to bury it.